we're going to return to cayenne pepper and follow another thread in the tapestry. But first, this is my father's birthday, August 25th. He would be 111 years old. He was born 1910 in New York City in the Bronx. And I'll start by telling one of his jokes, give you an idea of his sense of humor. There was a street urchin who was loitering in front of the Catholic Church, and there happened to walk by him a matronly society lady, and she stopped and said, "Young man, can you tell me, is Mass out?" And he said, "No, but your hat's on crooked." Okay, so we're going to start. First of all, I got to get my glasses here. I'm kind of situated. I don't have a hearth to read in front of, but this is a little homier than my usual background. Here's my notes. We're going to start with cayenne pepper's poem, An Ode to the Comeck, meaning an ode to the comic. This is found in the Knickerbocker, volume 43, 1854. This is the February 1854 edition we're going to be reading from. This is another one of those in really, really nice condition. Very small type. I'm not going to use near as many graphics this time. First of all, the last video took me 2 days to edit, and then I had to re-edit it because I made a mistake in the editing. And that's an awful lot of work. I don't know how many people are going to be interested in this. The other thing is that I realized when I went back and played yesterday's entry, or the previous entry rather, on YouTube, I found that the resolution is not nearly as good by the time that YouTube ends up processing it as what I'm watching when I play it back on my home computer, and possibly what posterity will see if people in the future look at these. So the type, when I show the type, it's not real easy to read on YouTube, and I apologize for that. It degrades about 50%, I would have to say. So anyway, here we have An Ode to the Comic. It says, wrote into the summer by Mr. Cayenne Pepper, Esquire. And I'll put this on the screen because the spelling is crucial. All hail, great luminary, twice all hail, grand physical visitor, you're welcome. In regions of space where all is silence and therefore no noise is heard, it is difficult to travel and not wake up something. But the great comic, meaning you, of course, has done it so for more than 50 years to the satisfaction of all present. Well, this is the great comet of 1854, which I looked up. And that's cayenne pepper's tribute to it. However, that's not the only time that Matthew used this gag of calling a comet a comic, which we will see in a little bit. Now, in the July 1854 edition, which here is in volume 44, there is a letter. This is a letter from Cayenne Pepper to his friend, the one that sends in his material to the Knickerbocker, P. Pepper Pod. All of this is Mathew Franklin Whittier. P. Pepper Pod is a reference to Matthew's childhood nickname, Peter Pumpkin, as I have determined from a great many clues, as I've shared before. And Cayenne Pepper is also Mathew Franklin Whittier, writing in a style very much like his known series, Ethan Spike. This introduces a poem also called To My Little House. But apparently, Cayenne Pepper has gone out to the country, see? And that's what he talks about here. He says, what would you think if you should see me now? Here I am, a rusty caton, far away from everything, by the side of a lovely expanse of water, which as I have first discovered its bentis, I don't know what that means, and don't know more other name, I apply my own signature, C-I-G-N-A-C-H-E-R, signature to it. So he's retired, at least temporarily, to the country. See, he's taken up a country residence. Well, Matthew wrote autobiographically. He would write about his own life and his own history, but then he would jazz it up with these characters and sign with a pseudonym so that nobody knew it was actually him. He does this over and over and over, so Cayenne Pepper having gone to the country means that Mathew Franklin Whittier, around this time, has also gone to the country. Now, whether he bought a place or rented a place or visited someone, I'm not sure. Apparently, it's in New Hampshire. Apparently, it's not too terribly away from Dover, New Hampshire, where he and Abby first eloped to. And it's not too terribly far away from where his brother and his sister live in Amesbury, Massachusetts. Because he obfuscates the names of places he is, I can't nail it down. I've tried, but I don't know exactly where he was. But before we leave this volume of 1840, it's volume 44 of 1854, there is a review of, I can't read the title of this thing. It's like a Greek name, Nuge or Nuge, Nugae. See, I'm not a scholar except where Mathew Franklin Whittier is concerned, but it's by Albert Pike. Apparently, he printed it for private distribution in one volume, 393 pages in Philadelphia. I wasn't aware of this before. I just stumbled upon it this morning. And the reviewer, I don't know who the reviewer is, probably one of the editors, waxes very eloquent about this volume and about Albert Pike in general. And he says that a friend of his introduced him to Albert Pike and said, "I want to make you acquainted with Albert Pike of Arkansas, one of your contributors and author of the Hymns to the Gods in Blackwood's magazine. And by Jove, he is one of the gods himself." That's the way the friend introduced him. And there's a mention down here, says, "We shall say nothing of the hymns to the gods. Several of them were written for and appeared in the Knickerbocker." So it says, and these, as was the case with those from Blackwood, were widely copied in this country. Now, I wasn't aware that any of them were printed in the Knickerbocker or written for the Knickerbocker, so now I have to go back and look for those. I have not done so. Pike tells Griswold, I believe, his biographer who printed some of his poems in a compilation, that he had written this series, Hymns to the Gods, when he was teaching, I think it was Fairfield, when he was teaching in like 1829 in Massachusetts, and that he wrote them at the desk while he was teaching this school. In actuality, these were class assignments, and at least a good number of them were originally written by Abby, Matthew's future wife, Abby Poyen. And then Pike stole them. And they had the same initials, AP, Abby Poyen, and Albert Pike. So Pike got them published, probably without her knowledge. And I imagine he thought that if he got caught, he could say he was publishing them for her. Well, she never outed him. And that was her Victorian sensibilities, turning the other cheek, her Christian sensibilities, and wanting to keep anonymous. And she felt that, justice is the Lord's, vengeance is the Lord's, rather, and that she would let things take their course. Matthew apparently said something to the effect that Albert Pike was a great plagiarist. That was quoted in a book, a biography about Pike, which I don't have right in front of me, as having come from a New York literary man. Well, I think that was Matthew. He was a New York literary man for many years, and I'm guessing that was an unattributed quote by Matthew, that he was a great plagiarist. I've been through all of that before. So along with a number of other poems which he claimed and modified, some of them were not claimed by Pike. Some of them were claimed by other people or not claimed. And I have poems by Abby under the same signature that occurred many years later, were published many years later posthumously, that he couldn't possibly have written. See, and then there's one that she wrote on her deathbed that Matthew caused to be published, a month after his death, which clearly wasn't written by Albert Pike. Same initials, AP. See, so, and then there were a whole bunch of stories signed AP that Matthew caused to have published posthumously in 1849, 1850, the Boston Weekly Museum. So these were not Albert Pike's poems. If there's any of these attributions that I ever set straight, that's the first one on the list. Not A Christmas Carol, not The Raven, but the work that Abby did, that one I definitely want. That and The Rag Picker I'm going to get straightened out before I pass on the slide. Now, Matthew was writing as another character named Caleb Leathers for the Portland Transcript. And he first shows up in the November 25, 1854 edition, which I have. I have several of these. All of this is going to be from originals now today, but most of it is going to be from this, the 1850, I think it's 54, 55 edition of the Portland Transcript. It's 2 years. So here we have Chips and Porridge. It's signed Caleb Leathers, and it's his very first one, and it's called The Philosophies. And here he talks about various writers and philosophers. Don Quixote. These are things he's talked about before. He explains Don Quixote. He says, I have been, quote, impressed to say, whether by the spirit of Cervantes or not, I can't say, a word about the false notion which is generally entertained in regard to the design of the author of Don Quixote. It is generally supposed that it was written to ridicule knight-errantry. When that book was written, knight-errantry had already become an, quote, obsolete idea. It didn't, of course, need to be laughed out of existence. The book was written rather to satirize the inflated romances, the, quote, yaller-kivered books of that day, which professed to historify the doings of the knights. It was these high-flown books that so hallucinated the inflammable Don and caused him to go forth on his imaginary errand of valiant benevolence. So this is typical of Mathew Franklin Whittier. He did exactly the same thing. He ridiculed these, cheap romances also. So that's Caleb Leathers. He doesn't say where he is. He doesn't indicate that he's a country farmer. All that came later. He's just a philosopher. Now, immediately following that is something by Juniper called A Sleepy Chapter about insomnia. Matthew had insomnia. This was another one of his pseudonyms. This was one of his habits to stack his pseudonyms one right after another on the page. He could do this because he was personal friends with the editors of these papers that he wrote to frequently. So this is beautifully written. It talks about his youngest daughter, Allie. He was long separated at this point from his second arranged marriage to Jane Vaughn, but he had moved to Portland to help raise his youngest daughter, Alice, or Allie, and she would come and visit him in his flat where he lived separately from the family. And this is one of two pieces he's written which makes an allusion to that. I won't go ahead and read it just to let you know that that's the case in there. Now, so Caleb Leathers and Juniper in the Portland Transcript are both Mathew Franklin Whittier. I believe Juniper shows up in at least one other paper, but I don't want to get too far afield here. Now, in the May 14, 1855 edition, see if I've got that one correctly marked. Okay, here we are. I found it. It's in the May 26th edition, but it's dated May 14, 1855 from Nashua, New Hampshire. And here he is in the country. Silence has been recommended by some apparently wise people, that is, if one has nothing of importance to say. Much writing or much talking are afflictions in their way. Of this eternal cackling we have a perfect right to get tired, and I have tried not to bore the public much with my thoughts. It may be, after all, that I have refrained not so much from a conscientious regard for the public's nerves as from sheer laziness or inability to put my thoughts in proper trim for publicity. But as Mother Nature is now making an effort to bud forth, I feel an irresistible impulse to act in unison with the loving dame, and would fain bud out mentally a trifle myself. But oh, neighbor Elwell, that's the editor, I find I am nearly, quote, winter killed. The frost of age and the chilly power of sickness have made it almost impossible for me to fructify. I am almost ready to be gathered to the valley of dry bones. But perhaps I can summon vital sap enough to present you one green bough from my dying top. But don't blubber, Caleb. Don't be lugubrious. Be game to the last, old boy, saith my good genius. Very well, sir, I shall. And then he says, speaking of, quote, budding forth, will lead me to allude to our vegetative prospects. heretofore New Hampshire has, and he speaks as a New Hampshire native now, who's a farmer, but he was never a New Hampshire farmer. See, he's adopted that persona, and apparently he has done exactly what K.N. Pepper says he has done, which is to go to the country. Maybe he bought a little place or rented a little place, so he's now a gentleman farmer. And truth be told, I think he now has a place to take Allie for a few days where he won't have any interference from Jane. That's my guess. He can let her run around in the garden and be free and so on. It's a wonderful atmosphere for a little girl who might be maybe 7 years old at that point. Allie's grave, by the way, is 5 minutes drive that away with her husband. She survived her husband only a year after his death. I believe he was a blacksmith, so I think it was a marriage of love. Maybe they were soulmates, and she only lasted a year. So what I feel is that the first two were troubled because he wasn't really able to raise them. He lived in New York City because he couldn't possibly live with Jane. And for the matter of that, I found evidence as to why he couldn't live with Jane. And that would take us on a whole nother track, which I'm very tempted to stop and get, but it would take some time. Maybe I'll go ahead and do that. And again, with the magic of editing, I'll come back. All right, I'm back. This is called Partitonian Patchwork, ostensibly by Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber. It contains a series called the Blifkins Papers about Blifkins the Martyr. These were stories, and I can't go into my proof now. I've done it before, but I can't go into that. But these were a series of stories that Matthew must have told his friend and the editor of the Carpetbag, Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber, about his marriage to Jane. And because Matthew was a humorist and he tried his best to make light of things, make light of tragedies, he told these hilarious stories about this situation of being married to this woman. It was an arranged marriage by his mother, apparently. Well, in one of them, these would have taken place, from 1842 until maybe 1849 when they separated formally, and then again in the early 50s, early to mid 1850s, when he was living in Portland separately to be able to help raise his daughter Allie, as I've determined. So because Shillaber rewrote a great many of these, probably, some of this is Matthew's prose, some of it is Shillaber's prose. There's a couple of Matthew's original poems that are stuck in here. They collaborated rather freely, so it's very difficult to tell whose writing is whose, but with one possible exception, all the stories are about Matthew that he told Shillaber. Well, here we have Blifkins the Ruralist. And so once again, one of Matthew's characters has gotten a place in the country. That's like the third one now. But the story is absolutely hilarious. The gist of it is that he has an alcoholic neighbor across the street who goes on binges. And somebody, I think it's his wife, Mrs. Blifkins, sees what she thinks is the neighbor in the window gone crazy, with delirium tremens and waving his arms like this, like he's going to, like maybe a knife or something, like he's going to stab himself or stab somebody. And she insists that Blifkins should go and stop him. See, well, Blifkins is, a little bit reluctant, understandably, to barge in there and, take the knife away from this character. And he goes to get the sheriff. Well, the sheriff is useless. Matthew says the sheriff was only elected because he couldn't do anything else in this little town. So they gave him the job of sheriff so he'd have a job. And finally he gets he gets the son of the alcoholic who goes over there and goes in and says, it's okay, it's just mother. She's bald as a plate and she's plucking hairs out of her head, see, because she wears a wig. Well, it's a very funny story, but these are the comments of Mrs. Blifkins. And remember, this is based on real life. So when the truth is revealed, she says, just as I thought, said Mrs. Blifkins, and anybody but a fool would have seen it at once. I declare I believe Blifkins is growing stupider and stupider every day. I'm thankful none of the children take after him. The thing is that Jane was really verbally and emotionally abusive. It's made light of as though this could be like anybody's marriage, and we all have to kind of take the good with the bad, and everybody has things that aren't quite ideal about their personality. But no, Jane was really abusive, domineering, and it was not just me that says so, because before his untimely passing, I spoke on the phone very early on in my research, and it was 2005, the same year that I discovered Matthew. I spoke with the curator at the Haverhill Public Library in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and talked to him a little bit about Matthew. And he said that this wife was a battle axe. That was his words. So just to give you an idea of a little bit of history, but we do have Blifkins also having taken a place in the country. So next we want to go to Ethan Spike. Now there's no question that Ethan Spike was Matthew's character. It's another one of these rustic characters who ends up in the big city off and on. And that he comes from a little town in Oxford County, which is a real county north of here. And it's a rather conservative place even now. And he apparently has attended a lecture. Now Matthew is very much in favor of lyceums, meaning lectures. He reports on them, and particularly he reports on the liberal and enlightened ones, to where he can spread the speaker's influence to the whole of Portland and possibly beyond. But as Ethan Spike, he's going to make fun of a lecture by somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about. And the gist is that the lecturer doesn't know what he's talking about, and then the preacher takes offense, and the preacher also doesn't know what he's talking about. So it's basically a bunch of people who have no idea what they're talking about. This one is a scream. This is my favorite Ethan Spike, and I would love to read it. I'm aware that I'm probably boring a lot of people, so I won't read it, but maybe I'll link to it on the YouTube channel so you can read it for yourself if you want to. But the gist is that he's talking about the same comet, probably the Great Comet. So the first lecture, he says, the first lecture of the season was given last night by James Peabody. Now you'll recall that I mentioned a book called Chanticleer, a Thanksgiving story of the Peabody family that I said was primarily written by Abbey. Well, Peabody is a name that Matthew loved to use in his humorous works. Appears over and over. I don't know how many times. If I can find how many times, I'll put it on the screen. So he's been 1/4 to an academary. So he's an expert because he's been 1/4 to an academy. General subject, astronomy. Particular, ditto, comics. So he's going to talk about wild comics. Well, a wild comic is obviously a metaphor for Matthew himself, who is a wild comic, kind of like Lee Camp, see, whom I've compared Matthew to. So he talks about comics or blazing stars. Comics, says James, says he, are of two kinds, the tame and the wild. The first is peaceable, t'other hain't. The first one is made of old moons as ain't fit for service, and is called by the uneducated shooting stars, but we of the schools call them meters, M-E-T-R-E-S. This difference led the speaker to remark that larnin is everything. So Matthew's making fun of people who think they know, but don't really. Now, this is not the first time he's done that. He's revisiting a theme that he had treated of before. And we're going to look at that right now. But before we do, I want to mention something about how many people would imitate Matthew. This is the Carpet Bag, 1851. And we are going to turn to the December 6th, 1851 edition. This is a story called A Modern Astronomer. It's by Enoch Fitzwhistler, who is really Sylvanus Cobb Jr., who was a very prolific short story writer of the era. Well, Sylvanus Cobb has mercilessly imitated Matthew's Ethan Spike style, and he's even taken a theme that Matthew would write on very soon as Ethan Spike, but had written on back in 1843, which suggests to me that Matthew must have shared the 1843 piece with Sylvanus Cobb. So the difference is it's competently written. The difference is that there's no philosophical import to this. There's no underpinning of philosophy in this. It's just a silly story about a guy who wants to give a lecture about astronomy, and he creates a model of the planets, the solar system, with vegetables. And he decides to practice on a bunch of sheep, being a rural fellow, and the sheep eat the planets. Well, it's funny, but like I said, it has no deeper philosophy. Matthew always had a philosophical point, or else he was surreptitiously telling a story about some intimate aspect of his marriage and courtship with Abby Poyen. See? Well, there's none of that with the imitators. I won't read any of this. Like I said, it's quite competent, technically. It's a good imitation, but it's a blatant imitation, I would have to say. Matthew must have just kind of good-humoredly gone along with these things. Now, we have to now go back to the 1843. This is actually 45, but somebody has stuck a couple of editions of 1843 in the back when they got this bound. They had a couple of them lying around and said, would you put these in the back too? So this is called Knowing Men. It's signed Poyns. Now, I can absolutely prove, and have given the proof for this, that Poyns was Mathew Franklin Whittier in the 1842-1843 Portland transcript, because John Greenleaf Whittier, his brother, writes him a letter and mentions one of the pieces that he had written with that signature and indicates that it was Matthew's. So we know that Poyns, anywhere he appears in the early 40s in the Portland transcript, that was Mathew Franklin Whittier. And that was my first big research break, because Poyns writes not only humorous stories, but serious short stories, and some of them are signed with Matthew's own name at this early stage, and poetry. So this was the first discovery I made of Matthew's poetry, was under Poyns. Well, this is called Knowing Men. And the gist of it is that in every small town, there's always somebody who knows more than everybody else. And here we have an astronomy lecture, and then we have the knowing man who knows more than he does. So, I once went to a service of a Unitarian Universalist church. I won't say where it was. And one of the members was giving a presentation about one of the founders of their church, meaning their movement. And when there was questions, or I don't even think it was questions, somebody raised their hand. And this lady in the audience, she knew more about the subject than the lecturer did. And I mean, she knew a lot more. She knew him personally. She had a nickname she called him, and it went on. And I was just dying inside, because she was totally upstaging this lecturer, see? Well, this is what Matthew's talking about, is a guy who doesn't know what he's talking about, giving a lecture in astronomy, and he's getting upstaged by the know-it-all, by the town know-it-all, see? And none of them have any idea what they're talking about. Now, I got a strong past life hit on this, and that was that Abby and I attended this lecture, and that it just absolutely left us in stitches. It's a very fond memory. And I had a vision of her. I've had very few visions of Abby. One of them seems implausible, technically, in terms of the details. This one is plausible. What I saw was we were standing in the back of the room, and she's wearing a black cloak with a cape, where you can barely just see like her nose sticking out of it. And she had very light skin, so, it's kind of a contrast. And she was diminutive, so she's this petite little lady with, this huge cowl, and just the tip of her nose sticking out. Well, I think she did that because she was very worried about other men coming on to her and how Matthew would react, because he was jealous. See, so she didn't want there to be some kind of altercation where somebody, came on to her and Matthew felt that he had to defend her and so on. So she was quite beautiful. So I think she didn't want to stand out, I would guess. Otherwise, it just seems funny that she would wear such a thing. Anyway, that's the past life memory side of it. But here, I'll just read a little bit of this. In every community that we are, now remember that Matthew almost always, even especially for his humorous pieces, he starts out with a philosophical preamble. This is no exception. In every community that we are acquainted with, there are more or less of these characters, By the term knowing, we do not mean to convey an idea of extensive book knowledge, as the individuals to whom it is applied are always wise above what is written, and usually cherish a wholesome and becoming contempt for those productions which less favored mortals are wont to admire. Your true knowing man usually wears glasses and a cane. His pace is grave and thoughtful, and his general appearance altogether solemn and commendable. If his location is in some quiet country village, quote, from noise and bustle far away, he shines with a peculiar luster. He is there the oracle, the very Alpha and Omega, the highest authority, from whose decisions there is no appeal. He is always possessed of the news in advance of the mail, and never under any circumstances allows himself to be betrayed into an expression of surprise, and so forth and so on. It's a beautiful piece, and the story is extremely funny, but it clearly prefigures Matthew's Ethan Spike story about the wild Comeck, which clearly has a connection with the Comeck in Cayenne Pepper. So all of these things interconnect. Okay, so here's the clincher. Matthew signs as a comet in the Portland transcript, the October 13, 1855 edition. And this one was written from the country as kind of a gentleman farmer or a farmer. And it's written to the editors. Clearly, he knows them and they know him, but he's not signing with any of his accustomed pseudonyms. The whole purpose of this is to defend his star signature, which I've said he used since 1829 and continued to use off and on until 1873, including the series in the New York Tribune, which historians believe was written by Margaret Fuller, thanks to her. So Matthew was the star in all those instances, but very soon, like a week or two after Margaret Fuller had died, coming back from Europe, she died like on the ship right off of New York City, Fire Island. A couple weeks later, Henry Ward Beecher, the preacher, who on eBay, if you get on eBay and look for a portrait of Henry Ward Beecher, you can find 100 of them. This man had his portrait taken continually. But anyway, be that as I have an idea who he is in this life, by the way, but I don't think I'll say here. Similar kind of character. So he started writing as the star for the New York Independent, and Matthew didn't like it. He didn't like it for posterity because I think he was convinced that sooner or later somebody would go looking for him and would do what I've done, which is to say to put together his legacy. And he didn't want anybody to think that that body of work by Henry Ward Beecher had been his, see, or that Henry Ward Beecher had written any of the other star sign material. So he left a clue. And this is how he did it. I talked about this before, but we got to go back to this 54-55 edition. And let me see, I know I have it marked. Give me a minute to find it. Okay, this is called A Letter from the Country. Again, it's the same thing. He's being a gentleman farmer. He's got a place out in the country, and he's introducing himself as though he's somebody new because he's not going to use the same pseudonyms. He says, a letter from the country is hardly in demand for the columns of your paper, I suppose, as I understand one of you lives in the country and has an eye to the facts and fancies of rural life, and many thousands of your readers are better versed in matters agricultural, horticultural, and rusticultural than is your humble correspondent. Beg pardon for that last. I said humble correspondent, but that was only a matter of form. I feel as far from humble as the biggest and best of you, for please understand that I have become one of the lords of the soil, one of friend Carey's true nobility, the unconquerable yeomanry of Maine. So he's taken a farm, a little farm somewhere, and he's introducing it. Probably it happened much earlier, or he'd been renting one and he just bought one, or something was new here. At any rate, he goes on and on about that and his crops and everything else, and basically makes fun of the fact that he's not growing enough to earn any money hardly at all if he were to try to sell it. Now he gets to the real purpose of writing. This is why he wrote A Letter from the Country and why he apologizes that that's nothing new. Now, down at the very bottom, he actually gets to the point of this letter. And he says, by the way, Can't you reckon me a, quote, special correspondent? Suppose you should allow me a corner in your editorial columns. To distinguish me from yourselves, you may give me some sort of a signature. A star, single asterisk, would do, but that would be rather too ambitious for a green hand. He's pretending he's a new writer. Besides being appropriated, and note the word appropriated, besides being appropriated by a distinguished correspondent of a certain New York newspaper, meaning Henry Ward Beecher. Perhaps it would be quite as suitable to mark my wandering paragraphs by the sign of that other class of heavenly bodies, known in the communication of your other correspondent, the Honorable Ethan Spike, Esquire, as, quote, comics. I shall venture thus to sign myself, distinctly endeavoring in all future flights not to obscure the star, asterisk, that shines over the, quote, Berkshire hills. Now, Matthew is Ethan Spike. So here again, as one character, he's referring to another of his characters as though it was a separate person. So he's saying that Henry Ward Beecher appropriated his star signature, that he would use it except for Beecher, and that instead he will sign with what Ethan Spike had recently written about, a comic or comet. And at the bottom of this, we have the comet as his signature, but the star is right next to it, directly above it. This is no accident. Again, he is leaving a trail for posterity, and I don't know it just from this evidence I've shared with you. I know it from, like, the evidence I'm sharing now is this much. I know it from this much. See, make sure I'm in the frame. I know it from this much evidence, not from this much that I've shared with you. See. So again, if you're judging from what I'm sharing now as proof, you're fooling yourself because you haven't really looked at the evidence. Anyway, I'm just sharing this now. This is Matthew saying that he's Ethan Spike for posterity, saying that he's the star as well, and making a reference to comets as comics, which also identifies him as Cayenne Pepper. So that's how Matthew's personal life is secretly reflected in all of these ostensibly humorous works. And this is how his different pseudonyms and characters interact with each other. And this is how you can take one little thread like Cayenne Pepper and pull it, and suddenly you're getting all this other material. Because if Matthew was the star and not Henry Ward Beecher, then by inference, he was the star and not Margaret Fuller. Because if Margaret Fuller had really been the star, he would have said something, because she was famous at that point for having written as the star. And he would definitely have accepted her and mentioned her. And he didn't say peep about Margaret Fuller. He only said that Henry Ward Beecher had appropriated it. See? So the fact, what he doesn't say speaks volumes here, because he doesn't mention Margaret Fuller, and that means that he was that series as well. But that would have been too complicated, because whereas Henry Ward Beecher appropriated the signature, Margaret Fuller appropriated the actual copy, see, and he can't really explain that. So he's left that alone. He's left us to infer that. So just about any thread that you pull in this tapestry is going to lead you to one of the famous ones, to Edgar Allan Poe, or to Charles Dickens, or to Margaret Fuller, or to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It so happened that this one, when I pulled it, led us to Margaret Fuller. Okay, so all the way from Cayenne Pepper and his comic, So there we have it. Again, I'm not going to use near as many photographic examples here. I'm afraid this has gotten rather longish anyway. And I noticed that people are gradually starting to look at that last one. The last one, I had to correct a whole bunch of mistakes. And a lot of times these mistakes come in when I'm reading from digitized copy instead of from the originals. I made a typo, in those digitized copies, and I read right on through the copy. Like I read peep as peel, for example. So I have to go in and re-record the voice and put the correct voice in the editing. And this last one I did a whole second round after having watched it and made notes. And when I created these little patch audio clips, I named one of them the same as the earlier round, see? And so when I imported it into the editing system, this is probably TMI, when I imported it into the editing system, it overwrote the previous one. So suddenly I have my voice saying something from a whole different part of the presentation. It's jarring. I had to fix that, so I did fix that. But I think we've had maybe 6, 7, 8 people have looked at this so far. I don't know. We'll see. It may go up a little bit. And this is an awful lot of work for like 8 people. 8 people is just about my cutoff. But hopefully there'll be people in the future that will see this as well.